London, 11:46 a.m., August 15th, 1940. Beneath the streets of Britain's capital, deep inside the reinforced concrete of Fighter Command headquarters, a low hum fills the operations room. Fluorescent lights flicker across a vast plotting table where miniature aircraft glide silently along rails and arcs drawn on a giant map of southern England. A dozen young women in khaki uniforms stand poised with long wooden rakes, nudging these tiny models across the surface. Chalk marks, grid numbers, Velcro tags. Their hands move quickly, precisely, each one tracking the real-time location of squadrons and enemy formations in the skies above. They don't speak unless ordered. Their eyes never leave the map. Behind them, a commander in RAF blue clenches a pencil between his fingers, scanning the room like a chess master watching a match unfold. A phone rings, short, sharp. A voice comes through, calm and clipped. Raid bearing through a 905, 30-plus bandits approaching Dover. Without hesitation, the nearest operator slides a cluster of red markers forward on the board. To the untrained eye, it looks like a child's game with toys and plastic markers. But this system, born from simplicity and desperation, is Britain's most advanced battlefield technology. By early 1940, war was no longer theoretical. The Blitzkrieg had torn through Poland. France and Britain, though technically at war with Germany since September 1939, had done little to stop Hitler's war machine. But behind closed doors, British command circles were already anticipating something far more severe, an all-out aerial assault on the British Isles. The Royal Air Force, though courageous and capable, was vastly outnumbered. If Germany launched an invasion, as most predicted they would, Britain would have to fight it off not with sheer numbers, but with speed, coordination, and ingenuity. The Germans had proven that mechanized, fast-moving warfare could break entire nations in weeks. Poland fell in 36 days. France collapsed in 6 weeks. Communications, fast, secure, and accurate, had proven just as critical as tanks or planes. In fact, speed of information had become the invisible weapon of modern war. And in this, Britain was not yet prepared. The airspace over England was immense, and the speed of German aircraft was staggering. Tracking raids as they crossed the channel required more than simply spotting them with binoculars or scrambling pilots based on guesswork. Any delay, even of 5 minutes, could mean the difference between successful interception and civilian devastation. British commanders needed to see what was happening in real time. But in 1940, real time meant something entirely different from today. There were no satellites, no digital maps, no computer networks. Everything had to be physical, mechanical, yet still fast, and most importantly, reliable. The key came not from advanced electronics, but from a synthesis of systems. Human observers, telephone lines, radar, and a new innovation that would change how wars were fought, the centralized operations room. At the heart of this system was something seemingly mundane, a plotting table. But this table would become the brain of British air defense. To populate that table with accurate information, Britain first relied on its network of ground observers, thousands of volunteers across the coast and countryside. These spotters, often using little more than binoculars and radios, would relay aircraft positions to sector control centers. There, women and men would transcribe, process, and interpret the data. Above them in rank, air commanders used these visual maps to direct RAF squadrons to intercept enemy bombers with near-surgical precision. This system would become known as the Dowding System, named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, head of RAF Fighter Command, and it would mark the world's first integrated air defense network. But there was a problem. The information coming in was fast, too fast for old methods of tracking and relaying. A paper map or handwritten chart wouldn't cut it. They needed something more dynamic, more flexible. That's when British engineers, working closely with officers from the Royal Navy and borrowing ideas from naval war rooms, turned to a strange but effective solution: mechanical plotting devices that resembled toy train systems. On the surface, it was simple. Use small wooden or metal markers to represent squadrons, aircraft, and enemy groups. move them in real time across a grid map as information came in. The idea wasn't new. Naval officers had been tracking fleet positions on boards for decades. But this was different. The scope was bigger, faster, more chaotic, and it had to work under pressure, with lives hanging in the balance. What emerged was a hybrid system that combined radar signals, observer reports, and telephone relays, all visualized using movable symbols on massive tables. These weren't electronic systems. They were mechanical, analog, but they were alive. Trained operators, many of them women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF, stood at attention, ready to nudge markers along prescribed paths using wooden rakes. Some pieces represented RAF squadrons. Others represented German bomber formations. Arrows indicated direction. Numbers indicated altitude. Colored flags marked friend or foe. It may have looked like a game, but it was not a game. Each movement represented the trajectory of real aircraft in the skies over southern England. Each adjustment was tied to incoming reports, often arriving by phone every few seconds. The entire room worked like a living machine, each part dependent on the others. And in the center, commanders watched with hawk-like intensity, making split-second decisions that could save or cost thousands of lives. This is what made the system so revolutionary. For the first time in history, a nation could respond to an enemy attack in real time, coordinating defensive actions across vast distances through a shared, live picture of the battlefield. The toy train style plotting board was more than just a visualization tool. It was a command weapon, and it was only the beginning. The foundations of this mechanical tracking system weren't built overnight, nor did they begin in the air. Long before RAF controllers were sliding markers across maps of Britain, naval officers had been plotting ship movements across ocean grids with sticks and chalk. The Royal Navy's tradition of maintaining a plotting room was centuries old, a method for keeping situational awareness of fleets dispersed across the Atlantic or Mediterranean. But what had worked for ships, slow-moving and often hours apart, had to be completely reinvented for the sky, where formations moved at hundreds of miles per hour and lives hung in the balance with each passing minute. It was the newly invented chain-home radar system that first made this possible. Britain had pioneered the early warning radar network, enormous steel towers lining the eastern and southern coasts. These massive antennae, some over 300 feet tall, could detect incoming aircraft at ranges of up to 120 miles. Yet radar alone was not enough. It could not determine altitude accurately. It couldn't always distinguish between friend and foe. Most importantly, the data it provided needed to be acted upon quickly, precisely, and comprehensively. Radar gave a warning, but humans still had to make the decision. This is where the operation rooms became essential. With so much information flooding in, there needed to be a way to distill, display, and command from it in real time. Engineers began constructing vast plotting tables surrounded by phone operators, radar interpreters, and message runners. The system wasn't digital. It wasn't even automated, but it was meticulously choreographed, like a stage performance in which every player had their mark, line, and timing. The visual component of this system, what later became known as the toy train method, involved miniature symbols to represent aircraft. These were moved across the table using long rods or rakes, like something out of a model railway enthusiast collection. Metal markers with colored flags or discs would show friendly or enemy aircraft, while small sliders indicated altitude. Some boards even had elevation layers mounted vertically. Each plotting table was grid, usually aligned with actual coordinates and sectors, and updated continuously based on calls coming from radar stations and observer posts. It wasn't a toy. It was a mechanical brain, and its operators were its neurons. Most of these operators were women, thousands of them, recruited into the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF. They were trained not just in clerical work, but in technical coordination, timing, and spatial analysis. Inside the darkened operation rooms of Fighter Command, they were the quiet hands of Britain's survival. In photos, they appear almost delicate, young women with tidy hair and steady expressions, standing over maps and nudging tiny planes across felt-lined tables. but their work was anything but passive. Every movement they made translated raw data into actionable command. The rooms themselves were constructed with precision. Each group headquarters, such as 11 Group at Uxbridge, responsible for defending London and the southeast, housed an operations room where a large map dominated the center. Above it, balcony levels held senior officers who watched the evolving picture unfold below. Along the sides, phones connected the plotters to filter rooms, where raw data from radar and observers was processed and cross-checked. These filter rooms would decode garbled messages, confirm sightings, and then pass verified updates to the plotters, often within seconds. At its best, the entire system ran with astonishing synchronicity. An enemy formation might be spotted by radar off the coast of Calais. Within moments, the information would be relayed to a filter room, interpreted, and passed to the operation room. There, a WAAF plotter would move a red marker representing the enemy group along the grid at the correct speed and bearing. Upstairs, a controller would see the movement and order a squadron from Biggin Hill or Tangmere into the air. Another operator would adjust the friendly squadron marker accordingly. Pilots in the air would then be guided by radio from sector control, intercepting the bombers before they could reach their targets. And all of it, every decision, every adjustment, hinged on those silent markers gliding across the board. To an outsider, it looked almost surreal. Toy planes, wooden rods, calm voices in the dark. But behind that illusion of simplicity was one of the most effective command and control systems ever devised. It didn't rely on speed alone. It relied on clarity. And in the confusion of war, clarity was everything. By the time the Luftwaffe began launching full-scale attacks during the summer of 1940, this system was no longer experimental. It was ready, and when the bombs began to fall, the women with the wooden rods were already in position, standing by their maps, waiting to move the first red disc forward. At the heart of this story lies not steel or circuitry, but people. Most notably, the young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAAFs. For many of them, the plotting rooms were their first exposure to war. They came from cities, towns, and farms, often with no military background, yet were thrust into the nerve centers of Britain's most crucial defenses. In their hands, small markers and rods became instruments of life and death. Despite the fatigue, the long hours, and the endless tension, they worked with stoic focus. Their hands were steady. Their concentration never wavered. They weren't just tracking aircraft. They were keeping watch over the very survival of Britain. The operation rooms demanded silence, discipline, and exact timing. Every gesture had to be perfect. A delay of 10 seconds could mean an entire squadron was sent to the wrong sector. Each operator worked in tight unison with the others, like dancers moving across a stage. They could not see the enemy. They didn't hear the engines or feel the bombs. But they saw the consequences: the missing squadrons, the scrambled markers, the toll exacted in red and blue discs. The human cost of their work was abstract, but deeply felt. Many plotters recognized the squadron numbers they were tracking. Some had brothers or friends flying those aircraft. The board was more than a map. It was a mirror of fate. Behind the human faces was the technology, not advanced by today's standards, but marvelously clever in its own time. The plotting tables at their core were analog computers. They combined spatial logic, mechanical movement, and symbolic data in a way that allowed commanders to make decisions at speeds unmatched in previous wars. Each piece was coded for meaning. Markers indicated type, colors showed allegiance, flags marked priority, and rods ensured movements were scaled and proportional to actual flight paths. The integration of real-time data, geographic overlays, and altitude indicators allowed an entire room to interpret the aerial situation within moments. Though it looked simple, just sticks on a table, the system required extensive training. Operators had to convert verbal reports into spatial adjustments instantly. They had to anticipate movements, maintain scale accuracy, and reset sectors without disrupting the rest of the map. It was not just pushing pieces. It was managing a living, breathing war machine. The tactical payoff was extraordinary. During the Battle of Britain, RAF Fighter Command relied on these plotting systems to make fast, accurate interception decisions. With limited squadrons and a small pool of trained pilots, every interception had to count. Wasting a sortie meant losing altitude, fuel, or even a plane. The ability to see multiple raids forming, track them simultaneously, and direct squadrons to their optimal strike points was only possible because of the plotting tables. Commanders could see, in a single glance, the shape of the battle unfolding, which direction enemy raids were splitting, where decoys were used, and which airfields were under threat. This allowed RAF controllers to practice economy of force, concentrating fighters only where they were most needed. One of the most powerful elements of this system was its ability to create a shared reality. Everyone in the room, from a youngest plotter to the senior air vice marshal, was looking at the same picture. There were no silos of information, no delays in reporting up the chain. The board was the truth, and that truth allowed Britain to punch above its weight. The Luftwaffe may have had superior numbers, but they never had a complete view of the sky. British commanders did, and they had it thanks to a grid, a rake, and a team of women who moved in silence beneath the roar of war. The plotting system wasn't flawless. Reports sometimes conflicted. Bad weather could distort radar returns. Phone lines were occasionally cut or delayed. But in its total design, the system worked. It filtered chaos into clarity. And it did so with tools no more advanced than a schoolroom pointer or a child's model airplane. What made it work wasn't the wood or metal. It was the coordination. The system turned information into geometry, geometry into decisions, and decisions into survival. The brilliance of Britain's plotting system did not lie only in its design, it lay in its leadership. At the top of that command pyramid was Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, head of RAF Fighter Command. Dowding was a quiet, reserved man, often misunderstood, sometimes criticized, but it was his foresight that made the system possible. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Dowding saw that the future of war would be decided not just in the air, but in the flow of information. He championed the integration of radar into the defense structure. More importantly, he understood that technology alone would not save Britain. It had to be paired with human coordination, discipline, and process. The Dowding system, as it became known, was the first fully integrated command and control network in military history. It connected detection, radar, filtering, intelligence, decision-making operations rooms, and execution fighter squadrons into a seamless, real-time machine. And at the heart of that machine was the plotting table. Dowding's leadership ensured that no detail was overlooked. He insisted on layered redundancy, radar backed by visual observers, telephones backed by runners, decisions backed by visual confirmation on the board. He understood that war produced fog, and that fog had to be cleared before decisive action could be taken. Under his command, the plotting rooms became not just centers of command, but symbols of precision. His calm demeanor set the tone. His refusal to panic, even in the darkest weeks of the Battle of Britain, was mirrored by the silence and focus of the rooms he had built. Dowding didn't need to shout to be heard. The system spoke for him. On the other side of the channel, the Luftwaffe never fully understood what they were up against. German air commanders believed they could overwhelm the RAF through sheer volume. They assumed that British radar might detect incoming raids, but they underestimated the speed and coordination of the British response. Time and again, German bomber groups found themselves intercepted with uncanny timing. Fighters seemed to appear out of nowhere, engaging with precision and then vanishing. The Germans tried deception, sending decoy flights, splitting formations, shifting altitudes. But the British system adapted. The plotters tracked the feints. The controllers read the patterns. And the squadrons intercepted accordingly. This invisible advantage frustrated the Luftwaffe. From the air, they couldn't see the board. They didn't hear the clipped voices relaying updates, the measured tones of controllers issuing orders. All they knew was that their bombing runs grew riskier by the day. Losses mounted, morale dipped, and still the RAF kept coming, not in waves, but in strikes timed with surgical accuracy. The Germans thought they were fighting pilots. In truth, they were fighting a system. And that system was being guided by young women with sticks in a bunker hundreds of feet below ground. There was something deeply moral about it all. In an age of brute force, this was a victory of the mind. The plotting table didn't drop bombs or shoot down planes. It didn't make noise. It didn't kill. But it saved lives, thousands of them, by allowing Britain to act smarter, faster, more efficiently. It was warfare without firepower, strategy without spectacle. It was proof that organization, not just courage, could shape history. There's also a quiet heroism in the roles that history, too often forgets. The WAAFs didn't wear medals. Their names weren't printed in newspapers, but they stood for hours in bomb-proof rooms, breathing recycled air, moving markers that could determine the fate of a city. They witnessed invasions unfold in miniature. They knew when squadrons vanished from board. They tracked raids that struck their own towns. Yet they never flinched. They never failed. Their precision was as vital as any Spitfire or Hurricane in the sky. This moral edge, this victory of coordination over chaos, gave the British people something to believe in. In a time of invasion alerts, air raid sirens, and ration books, there was comfort in knowing that someone, somewhere, could see the whole picture. That the enemy was not unchecked. That the sky was being watched, and more than watched, it was being understood. August 13, 1940. The Luftwaffe called it Adlertag, Eagle Day. It was the beginning of Hitler's all-out aerial assault on Britain, the opening move in Operation Sea Lion. The objective was clear: destroy the Royal Air Force on the ground and in the air, paralyze Britain's ability to defend itself, and pave the way for invasion. That morning, over 1,400 German aircraft took to the skies, bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes, sweeping west from occupied France and the Low Countries, crossing the Channel in coordinated waves, but they were not unseen. At 5:45 a.m., the massive steel towers of Chain Home lit up. Echoes bounced off formations, gathering over Calais. Operators noted blips, heights, bearings. Within minutes, phones rang inside the filter rooms. Coordinates were logged, directions cross-checked. On the plotting table of 11 Group headquarters at Uxbridge, a red disk appeared near the southeast corner of the map, an enemy formation inbound. A WAAF plotter reached forward with her wooden rake and moved it along the grid. Another disk followed, then another. The map came alive. On the upper balcony of the room stood Air Vice Marshal Keith Park. He watched without speaking. His eyes moved from disk to disk, seeing not markers but bombers. Fighters. Lives. He turned to the controller beside him. Scramble Tangmere. Vector to intercept. Moments later, RAF squadrons were in the air, hurricanes roaring off grass runways, pilots gripping control sticks with white-knuckled anticipation. In the plotting room, friendly markers, blue this time, moved in response. It was a game of cat and mouse drawn in real time, and it played out over and over all day long. From early morning until dusk, waves of German aircraft probed, tested, and attacked. The targets were airfields, radar stations, supply lines. The Luftwaffe was betting that Britain couldn't keep up, that somewhere in the fog of war, the system would break. But it didn't. Every new raid was plotted within minutes of crossing the channel. Updates came by the second. Spotters on cliffs relayed engine sounds. Radar tracked altitude shifts. Filter rooms consolidated it all and fed it to the map. In Uxbridge, the tables swarmed with motion, red arcs forming over Kent, blue arcs rising to meet them. Controllers issued orders. Plotters adjusted markers. Pilots followed vectors. The entire defense of Britain moved in sync with a board and a rake. It was not without cost. Some squadrons were overwhelmed. Airfields were hit. Pilots were lost. But the system held. And because it held, Britain responded to every raid with deadly timing. Even when fighters were outnumbered, they were placed exactly where they were needed. No guesswork. No delays. The board was always telling the truth, and commanders trusted it. Over the coming days, the tempo increased. August 15th saw the largest assault yet. Over 500 bombers and 1,200 fighters attacking in coordinated strikes. But by then, the operators were faster. More precise, the plotting rooms had settled into a rhythm that was almost martial in its calm. Hands moved across the table like clockwork. Voices remained clipped and clear. Every marker told a story, and every story ended with action. The Germans had no such system. Their coordination was limited by visual contact and radio confusion. They often flew blindly into defended sectors, unaware that RAF fighters had been vectored minutes earlier to intercept. German losses began to climb. Confidence began to crack. Commanders in Berlin were puzzled. How could the RAF still be fighting with such intensity, such focus? The answer was in a darkened room beneath Uxbridge, where a map told the story of the sky. There was no flash to the system, no glamour. It didn't fire guns or drop bombs. But in those critical weeks of August, it was the quiet engine behind every British success. The system absorbed chaos, translated it, and returned clarity. And with that clarity, Fighter Command inflicted enough damage to make Hitler hesitate. That be why early September, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed, and the board never stopped moving. If any single day tested the full weight of Britain's real-time plotting and interception system, it was August 18th, 1940, later known as the hardest day. It began as so many others had that month, with early morning reports of Luftwaffe formations gathering over northern France. But the scale was different. The formations were tighter, the altitudes higher. By 10 a.m., it was clear that Germany was launching a full-spectrum assault aimed at crushing RAF airfields, aircraft factories, radar stations, and breaking the resistance that had so far held firm. In the plotting rooms of 10, 11, and 12 groups, the maps exploded into movement. Red markers swept westward in multiple vectors. By midday, over 850 German aircraft had crossed the channel. Fighter Command's response would have to be precise, brutally so, or the airfields at Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Ford could be knocked out of operation. And with them, Britain's ability to resist. At Uxbridge, the tension was electric. In the operations room, the air was thick with heat and sweat. Telephones rang constantly. Chalk scribes updated wallboards. WAAF plotters moved with a speed and confidence born of habit, but even they were tested by the sheer number of formations. Red discs filled the board like drops of blood across southern England. Every few seconds, a voice would call out a bearing or altitude. A hand would reach out. A marker would slide. On the balcony above, Keith Park leaned forward, hands clasped behind his back. He had less than 100 fighters immediately available, spread across squadrons already worn down by days of relentless combat. Every decision he made had to count. There was no time for delay, no room for error. From aboard, he saw the enemy split. One group was heading for Kenley, another toward Southampton, a third, possibly a decoy, angled toward the Thames estuary. Park scanned the markers, considered the altitudes, and made the call, scramble north wheeled. 56 Squadron to intercept at Maidstone. Scramble Tangmere, vector 43 degrees. The orders moved down the line. In the fields, sirens blared. Mechanics ran. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Engines roared to life. In minutes, Hurricanes and Spitfires were airborne, climbing fast to meet formations tens of thousands of feet above. The board reflected this in silence, blue markers arching toward red. What followed was one of the most intense days of air combat in history. Over the skies of the South Coast, British and German aircraft collided in swirling dogfights. Bombs fell on airfields, hangars, and radar towers. At Kenley, a hangar was destroyed. At Ford, bombers struck parked aircraft. Biggin Hill took repeated hits but remained operational. British losses were heavy, but German losses were worse. The system held. Every time a raid changed course, a voice reported it. Every time a pilot called in, it was logged. Every time an enemy formation was detected, it was plotted. The sheer volume of updates was staggering, and yet the map continued to reflect reality. It guided commanders to deploy squadrons with terrifying precision. Even when outnumbered, the RAF struck where it mattered. Not everywhere, but always where it could hurt the most. By the end of the day, 68 German aircraft had been destroyed. The RAF lost 31 fighters, a painful cost, but survivable. What mattered more was what didn't happen. No airfield was knocked out permanently. No radar station was destroyed beyond repair. No part of the system collapsed. It bent, but it did not break. Inside the plotting rooms, the final markers of the day were reset. The board was cleared. Operators slumped in silence, exhaustion creeping into their limbs. Controllers removed headsets. Chalk was wiped from the walls. Outside, searchlights scanned the evening sky. The hardest day had come and gone, and Britain still stood. From a military perspective, the events of August 18th proved what many had suspected, that Germany could not sustain the offensive indefinitely. The cost was too high, the results too inconsistent. But what mattered more, in the eyes of history, was that a system built on wooden markers, rakes, and human discipline had stood up to the largest air force on Earth and endured. It had done more than survive. It had shaped the course of the war. The Battle of Britain officially ended on October 31st, 1940. But the war did not. Bombs continued to fall. Raids returned in waves. And yet, Britain no longer stood on the brink. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority, and Hitler's plans for invasion were shelved indefinitely. Much of that victory, quiet, methodical, and unseen, was owed to the system that had held the line. The plotting rooms, the real-time battle maps, the chalk and wooden wire, these tools had not only allowed the RAF to survive. They had laid the foundation for modern military command and control. After the battle, the British High Command reviewed every facet of the system. What had worked? What had been under pressure? Where improvements were needed? The conclusion was clear. The core was sound. The plotting system, far from being a stopgap, was a blueprint, and so it was refined. More sectors were added. Filter rooms expanded their capabilities. Radar coverage was increased to fill blind spots. Redundancies were built into communication lines. The wooden markers remained, but now accompanied by improved symbol sets, new flag codes, and better vertical displays for altitude. More training centers were established. Hundreds of new WAAF recruits passed through courses to become proficient plotters, filterers, and communication specialists. Their work extended beyond air defense. The same systems began to appear in naval convoy coordination centers and in underground bunkers tracking V-1 and V-2 rocket attacks. What had begun as an adaptation, a desperate measure using tools that resembled toys, had evolved into a cornerstone of wartime information architecture. As the war expanded beyond Britain's skies, the plotting concept followed. In North Africa, British commanders used mobile versions of the system to coordinate tank movements across the desert. In the Atlantic, the Royal Navy and Coastal Command adapted plotting rooms to track U-boat packs threatening convoys. Even in the Pacific theater, Commonwealth forces drew on British techniques to build similar boards for air-sea coordination. Wherever a battlefield became too large, too fast, or too invisible to control directly, the principle of the plotting table was introduced: observe, filter, visualize, command. But the most profound evolution came with the integration of new technology. Radar was improving rapidly. Signals became clearer, altitudes more precise. Engineers began experimenting with cathode ray screens and analog computers. Yet instead of discarding the old system, they layered the new onto the old. Radar inputs were matched to plotting boards. Predictive tools were developed to estimate future positions based on velocity. The map became not only a reflection of the battle, but a projection of what might come next. Throughout it all, the human component remained central. Technology helped, but it didn't replace the judgment of trained operators. The WAAFs, controllers, and intelligence officers became faster, sharper, more intuitive. Their minds had been shaped by fire, hours of pressure, repetition, and instinct. No machine could replace that kind of experience. The board was still moved by hand, still read by eye, still operated by human minds wired to see the invisible shape of war as it moved. Even as the Blitz turned into the broader war, the operations rooms continued to function. During the D-Day landings in 1944, British and Allied planners used enlarged versions of plotting systems to monitor aircraft formations, track naval units, and coordinate drops. The basic premise remained unchanged: real-time tracking, visual communication, decentralized awareness feeding centralized command. By then, other nations had taken note. The Americans, deeply impressed by British systems, adapted many of the concepts into their own command structures. USAF bomber commands used similar plotting tables to track raids over Germany. Naval task forces introduced plotting boards for carrier-based aircraft coordination. The concept had spread, not as a British secret, but as a new doctrine of warfare. Information must flow, be visible, and be acted upon instantly. And yet, even as new electronics and computers emerged, many commanders continued to favor the tactile simplicity of the map, the marker, and the human eye. It wasn't just habit, it was trust. In a war defined by uncertainty, this system had delivered certainty when it was needed most. The war was far from over. But the battle to see, to understand, had already been won. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the war rooms didn't disappear. Instead, they transformed. Britain, along with its wartime allies, recognized that the lessons of the plotting table went beyond the battlefield. The ability to visualize a dynamic situation in real time, to command from a central picture and react instantly to changing threats, was not just useful in war. It was essential in a world now entering the atomic age. In the Cold War that followed, command and control became the backbone of military doctrine. Underground bunkers were built not just in Britain, but across NATO countries, steel-reinforced operation centers layered in secrecy and surveillance. And inside many of them, the spirit of the wartime plotting room remained. Massive wall maps, color-coded markers, and analog boards continued to serve generals and commanders even as digital systems began to emerge. Old tools were not discarded overnight. They were blended with new technology: radar screens beside paper plots, radio transmissions beside teleprinters. The principle remained unchanged: know the battlefield, display the battlefield, control the battlefield. By the 1950s, the concept had moved into civilian life. Air traffic control systems across Europe and North America adopted plotting methodologies based on wartime experience. The way flights were monitored, using paper strips, radar echoes, and visual boards, directly mirrored the WAF-operated rooms of fighter command. In a very real sense, the safe movement of tens of thousands of aircraft today owes a debt to the women who once tracked dogfights over Kent. Military academies began teaching the doubting system as a case study in integrated warfare. Commanders learned not only about radar and radio, but about the importance of flow, how raw data becomes action when properly visualized and interpreted. The human-machine relationship became a central concern. Could a system remain flexible under pressure? Could people still make the right call when the picture changed by the second? These were questions first answered not in theory, but in the heat of 1940. In modern terms, the plotting board laid the psychological and procedural foundations for what we now call C2, command and control. Today's militaries use satellite feeds, GPS-linked battlefield networks, and AI-assisted threat analysis. Yet even now, in the most sophisticated command centers, visual mapping is still present. Whether through digital dashboards or live-updating mission tiles, the essence is the same: a shared picture, universally understood, instantly actionable. Even more profoundly, the legacy of the plotting room shifted how we understand warfare itself. It demonstrated that leadership was not just about bravery or charisma. It was about comprehension. Those who could see clearly, even through the fog, could lead effectively. In that way, the quiet rooms beneath Uxbridge and Bentley Priory redefined the role of a commander. They no longer stood on hillsides or front lines. They stood beside maps, observing the pulse of battle as it unfolded. For Britain, the memory of those plotting rooms became part of its cultural DNA. Museums preserve the boards. Former WAF operators, long after the war, returned to see the markers they once pushed. Their hands had once moved small wooden tokens. but their work had altered the shape of the nation's future. In 2015, the underground operations room at Uxbridge was restored and open to the public. The board remains intact, as it was on the day the Battle of Britain ended, red and blue markers still frozen in silent confrontation, a still life of strategy at its finest hour. Their legacy is not just historical, it is methodological. The plotting system proved that information, even when imperfect or partial, becomes powerful when shared and acted upon. It taught that no amount of raw data matters unless someone can read it, can see it, and can move. And in the darkest days of Britain's war, that movement didn't come from machines, that IT came from hands, from eyes, from voices in the dark. In the grand scale of World War II, with its tanks, fleets, and firestorms, the story of wooden markers sliding across a table might seem small. But in truth, it was one of the war's greatest triumphs of thought over force. The plotting rooms of Britain were not battlefields, yet they decided the fate of battles. They did not roar or burn or bleed, but they pulsed with quiet urgency, places where the invisible became visible and where clarity overcame chaos. There was something deeply human in those rooms, not just in the people who worked them, though their steadiness and silence formed the very spine of Britain's defense, but in the idea itself. That war could be fought not only with firepower, but with foresight. That victory might belong not only to those who shot first, but to those who understood the shape of the fight. It was not the system's sophistication that made it powerful. It was its elegance, its simplicity, a table, a map, a few color discs. And yet, from those humble tools came one of the most advanced coordination efforts in military history. It reminds us that technology is only ever as effective as the thinking behind it, and that the most effective systems are often the ones built not for show, but for survival. For the women who stood for hours, guiding markers across the map with wooden rods, their role was often unseen and uncelebrated. But they were the nerves of the system, transmitting thought, anticipation, and decision through quiet motion. They held the line not with weapons, but with unwavering discipline. In doing so, they gave Britain its edge and its chance to endure. And perhaps that's the deeper truth. In a world collapsing into flames, it wasn't just steel or firepower that kept the darkness back. Sometimes it was a hand on marker, a voice on a phone, a calm decision made in a room where the sky was drawn in ink and wood. The war raged above, but beneath it, in the silence of the plotting rooms, the future was being shaped, one movement at a time.